One, we are waiting a few seconds for other people to join. Okay, well, I think we can start now. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about regenerative agriculture in agricultural value chains. So today we will introduce a partnership in which South Pole and Biosphere are now involved. We will show you why this partnership can play a role in scaling up the transition towards more sustainable farming practices, such as regenerative agriculture. Next slide, please. So your microphones are muted at the moment. Rest assured that we'll have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And in the meantime, you can, of course, ask all your questions directly in the chat, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. So we are pleased to introduce today's speaker, Morgane Hivernio, who is the Global Head of Sustainable Terroir at Pernod Ricard. She will share the feedback of Pernod Ricard agroecological transition strategy and how Pernod Ricard is taking action through its agricultural value chains. We also have Sébastien Romégou, who is the CEO and founder of Biospheres. He will present Biospheres and share his experience with Pernod Ricard as well. And of course, myself, Adrien Yes, I am coordinating a team of consultants dedicated to agricultural value chains for France and Belgium at South Pole. Next slide, please. Before giving the floor to Sébastien and Morgane, please let me introduce the how and why of our partnership. Next slide. First, we will talk about what is regenerative agriculture, which we will now call Regen Ag, and why is it the focus of our session today. Next slide. So basically, we can find many definitions of Regen Ag. For the purpose of this presentation, we have chosen the definition of the OP2B, so it's One Planet Business for Biodiversity, which looks at basically the outcome of the concept of Regen Ag. This definition covers topics related to soil health, climate and carbon, and greenhouse gases, biodiversity, water, farm resiliency, farm security, and also economy. So basically, and more practically, Regen Ag encompasses a broad range of farm practices which can provide all those kinds of benefits to all those kinds of topics. Regen Ag practices can go from the relatively simple, so composting or no-till, to the more complex, such as cover crops or agroforestry, and all their possible combinations and variations. Next slide, please. The importance that we give to Regen Ag comes from a well-known fact. While agriculture is an important contributor to global warming, it is also one of the most exposed sectors, facing the disruption of rainfall patterns, which is affecting yields, the rising temperatures, which cause plant cycle disruption, and also the greater occurrence of fires and storms, the loss of biodiversity, and also the loss of pollinator populations, which is a huge threat to all agriculture, and last but not least, the rising sea levels, which are impacting soil quality and soil fertility in low altitude areas. Next slide, please. So while Regen Ag does not claim to be the absolute solution to these challenges, it greatly helps improve the environmental and economic resilience of farms. Studies show that adopting regenerative agriculture practices in a farm can have beneficial economic impacts over 4 to 10 years, with return of investments around 15 to 20%, and of course, increased productivity. Another important topic is that involving agricultural suppliers in regenerative farming is also a way for companies to build loyalty and secure also part of their supplies. This is what Pernod Ricard is doing with a dual terroir and ingredients approach that Morgane will also introduce later on. Next slide, please. So with all its benefits, Regen Ag remains a radically different approach to farming. Implementing it at farm level and at value chain level takes time and needs also concerted efforts. The goal of our partnership is to provide support to companies willing to transform their value chains through the implementation of Regen Ag. Next slide. First, who are we? I mean, we, South Pole and Biosphere. South Pole is an international provider of climate solutions, which is helping companies design and achieve their climate objectives. We have expertise, climate expertise in the agricultural sector, and we also took part in the development of several initiatives, such as the International Platform for Insetting and also the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, Land Sector and Removal Guidance. We rely on in-house expertise with consultants all over the world and international network of partners. We also have ongoing partnerships and references with the major companies in the sector, and we have helped them design and implement their climate strategy. Next slide, please. Now, Biosphere. Who is Biosphere? Biosphere is a company specialized in regenerative agriculture. Biosphere has tools, can provide training and support services to enable farmers to change their practices at farm level towards Regen Ag. Biosphere relies on agronomists and a network of partners on Regen Ag and also agroecology that can operate anywhere in the world. And finally, Biosphere also has strong references in the implementation of sustainable agricultural practices for several crops and major brands. Next slide, please. Now, why have we created the partnership and what solution does it provide to your companies and your value chains? So that partnership was born of two observations. First one, the agricultural sector offers solutions to both reduce greenhouse gas emissions and also increase carbon sequestrations. And second observation, an increasing number of companies wish to engage their value chains in regenerative agriculture. However, they found it very difficult to do so because of the complexity of the supply chains, the fragmented structure of the supply chains, and the multiplicity of stakeholders being in their supply chains. By combining South Pole experience in climate strategies and Biosphere's on-the-ground expertise, we aim to offer support to define your climate commitments linked to your value chains and also following the highest standard of climate science. And we will also support you in the implementation of regenerative agriculture practices at farm level to help you reach your climate commitments. Next slide, please. Briefly, our partnership provides support through 6 stages. The first one, calculating your company's carbon footprint for all scopes following the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and its guidances. Second step, setting your emission reduction targets in line with the Science-Based Target Initiative guidances. Third step, designing together your climate roadmap in which the transition to regenerative agriculture will very likely have an important role to play. Fourth step, implementing sustainable farming practices through pilot programs with selected farms, and this program and these practices can be scaled up later on. Fifth step, measuring every year the changes in the pilot farm's carbon footprints. And sixth steps, integrating those changes, those farm level changes in your company's carbon footprint. Then after that sixth step, our support will enter an iterative phase. With each year, the support to the farmers will keep increasing, and we hope that we'll keep implementing more and more regenerative practices. Each year, we will also update all the farmers' carbon footprints and on a yearly basis, integrating these farmers' carbon footprints in your company's own carbon footprint. Of course, if your company has already gone through the first 1, 2, or 3 steps, our level of support can be adjusted accordingly. Next slide, please. Now, depending on your ambitions, 2 levels of offering are available. The first one on the left in yellow is our core offer. supporting the implementation of your regenerative agriculture roadmap, and measuring progress and impacts on your company's carbon footprint over the years. On the right, we have a more strategic approach. In addition to what is already included in the core offer, we can also include a cost assessment and the design of a plan for financing the transition. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, our partnership offers a single interface for your climate strategy and the implementation of regenerative agricultural practices at field level, and also a double expertise in climate impact assessments and the implementation of large-scale transition plans. And finally, a structured process and customized tools to continuously assess and quantify the climate impact of the transition. Next slide, please. So now that we have seen the theory around Regen Ag and around our partnership, we can see now that in practice, Regen Ag is already being implemented by companies across the globe within their value chains. Why? Next slide. Well, one important thing is that recent regulations and initiatives are pushing companies to go further in measuring and reporting the impact of agriculture in their value chain. We have the SBTi's flag guidance that is asking companies to set specific emission reduction targets for their upstream agricultural emissions. We have the CSRD, the famous European directive, which is redefining CSR and environmental reporting. And the CSRD will be publishing a specific standard for companies in the agricultural sector in the coming months. And finally, we also have the European CS3D that has identified companies with an agricultural value chain as under high environmental risk, and also that will involve a specific set of reporting measures that has to be clarified. Next slide, please. Consumers are also becoming increasingly aware and informed, with sustainability gradually becoming a purchasing criteria. So the products with a sustainable claim outsold those without sustainable claim. The consumers are also associating farming practices, agroecology, and sustainability. And the consumers are also aware that soil health is a major environmental issue. Next slide, please. So based on those observations, several companies have started acting and made sustainable sourcing, Regen Ag, and agroecology a cornerstone, a pillar of their business and CSR strategy. The first one on the left is Unilever, which has put sustainable sourcing of agricultural commodities at the heart of its sustainability strategy. On the right, we have Yves Saint Laurent, which works directly with its suppliers to incite them and push them towards a transition towards agroecology and Regen Ag practices. And we also have General Mills in the middle below, that has a dedicated pillar dedicated to Regen Ag in its CSR strategy. Slide, please. So now, after these contextual elements, I give the floor to Sébastien, the CEO of Biospheres.
Hello, everyone. I'm very glad to be here. And I'm very glad that within 10 years, many things have changed in the sector of regenerative agriculture. At this time, it was agroecology, and now it's regenerative agriculture, is how to regenerate ecosystem thanks to the right agricultural practices. And we will see what we can do in specific projects at large scale to affect your supply chain. Next slide, please. So just to present a little bit more Biosphere, and thank you, Adrien, for introducing the company. Biosphere is an extension of what we do for about 10 years. It has started through the Developing Center of Agroecology 10 years ago. And now it's a consulting company, Biosphere, fully dedicated to large-scale transition toward regenerative agriculture. What we our aim, our mission is to simplify this transition by constituting a one-stop shop of the agricultural transition. So we do that with Biosphere and several brands. So we have Unisphere, which is a training center for technician and farmer. We train about 1,200 people per year. eSphere, which is an MRV that help us to follow the data and to measure the impact of the regenerative supply chain and the practices on the farm, and Microsphere, which is dedicated to the exploration of soil life and soil biology to help us to reduce especially the chemical inputs, the fertilizers, and that's important for us to understand it pragmatically and scientifically. Next slide, please. So our specialty, our expertise is to shift toward conventional agriculture, to regenerative agriculture, which leads to use more and more plants to build our farming systems. Many people are looking toward the definition of regenerative agriculture, and that's important to have a clear definition. But at the end, the principle behind regenerative agriculture is to use plants which are at the heart of the energy flow in ecosystems and use those plants to build farming systems that are better in terms of photosynthesis yield. So at the end, we are changing many things. If you are traveling throughout an agricultural landscape, most of the time it's brown, it should be green. So that's what we do, and that's what we develop everywhere in the world. Today we work in about 20 countries, especially in temperate and arid area, which are quite tricky sometimes to stabilize regenerative farming systems. So next, please. So here you can see an example that's important to be like factual. So that's a way to change a traditional farming systems. We are here for Andros. We are in Spain in a very arid area. So we have like more or less 200 millimeters of rainfall per year, which is very few. What we did is, as a first step toward regenerative agriculture, is to use cover crops, the right seeds of cover crops to cover the soil. And as you can do in February, it's like very green, and it does not happen usually in this area. In this area in February, it's just bare soil. And then in August, this cover crop has been destroyed, and it's nice soil cover. In this soil cover, you have a lower temperature. It's a better ecological niches for soil biodiversity. You have sequestrated carbon through these cover crops. And something interesting, we have fight the weeds in the field. If you take the same photo in the next field at exactly the same day, what you have in the right-hand side in August 22, the same, you have plenty of perennial weeds, which are very difficult to manage for the farmer. And the farmer says, oh, that's interesting, because with regenerative agriculture, I can save money and time, because I don't need to fight against weeds as I do usually. And actually, the money saving we do throughout these weeding practices, which do not happen in our farming system, regenerative one, this money is used to pay the cover crop and to manage the cover crop. So in terms of economical balance, for the farmer, it's the same. But at the end, he has understood that with the regenerative practices, he is capitalizing on soil fertility, and that's very interesting for him in the middle and the long term. And that's important to have such economical approach for the farmer to convince him and to have a high rate of adoption of the practice. And for me, that's this philosophy is very important to scale up the regenerative practices, because it should be good for the environment, it should be good for the external reports of big companies and for your environmental impact. It's very important, but also it should be good for the money for the farmer. And that's the approach we try to develop everywhere. You can go in the next slide. So here the same, that's in France, in the Bordeaux region. So I like very much the vine in this area, but the problem is that the classical system is really bad for on many aspects on the environment. It's mainly bare soil. It's changing a little bit right now for about 1 or 2 years, but it's usually bare soil. And it's not good for carbon sequestration. It's not good for water infiltration. Those plots are prone to erosion. For the biodiversity, they have nothing to feed on, and they do not have too much habitats. So the classical system, which is good for wine production, is not good for the environment. So how to find a way to get a good economical approach for the farmer, but also a better farming systems in terms of environment. So what we do usually, we try to segment the transition towards regenerative agriculture. Here we have designed an agroecological system, so regenerative system level 1, where you have a cover crop in the ante row, and this cover crop is full of leguminoses, which are capturing nitrogen from the air and put it in the soil. And at the end, it's quite interesting because we have a cover crop which is protecting and covering the soil. It's 1 up to 2 rows. It does not change a lot of things in terms of workload and workflow for the vineyard growers, because the farm worker can go in one ante row to work usually as they do usually. So you do not have to change too much on the farming systems and on the organization. But at the end, you are saving money, because usually they are tilling the soil to get rid of the soil cover very early in the season, February. Now with the cover crops, they are destroying it in April. So that means they are saving 2 passes of weeding in the season. So that's around 4,000, 5,000 euro of saving. That means thanks to these savings, they can pay the cover crops, and they have some money which is there as well. So that's nice, because this intermediate system is a good proposition, technical and economical, to scale up in this area. And then you have the best in class in terms of regenerative agriculture on the right hand side, but it's not for everyone. At least in the next future, because you have to change so many things in the farming system that the adoption rate is not so good for like the next years. So that's important to segmentate and to planify the transition in such a way that it's acceptable for the farmer in the short term. Then you can train them, educate them, discuss with them, build with them the new farming methods, and then they are prone to go beyond this intermediate level 1 regenerative farming systems. Next. So of course, more you are going in the best-in-class system, more you are good in water, carbon, biodiversity. Water infiltration is better, biodiversity is high because you have a lot of ecological niches, you have a lot of food in terms of flowers, but also plant biomass that can be consumed by soil life and some other organisms that feed on it. And for carbon, you are sequestrating it. So that's interesting to counter this ecosystem degradation thanks to plants and thanks to new farming systems that can be scaled up at large scale, thanks to this economical approach. Let's go. So usually when we implement a project, we have several phases. The first 3 phases are important. We are exploring what happens in your supply chain. It lasts usually 2, 3, 4 days. Then we are going to several farms representative. We are going into audit. And then we can design a strategic plan according to the farmer needs and according to the critical issue of the area in terms of environment. And then we go in pilot and program, which is lasting between 2, 3, 4 years. And then we can scale up new practices that we have tested in this area. Most of the time, the scale-up phase is starting when the pilot program is not completely finished, because we know where we should go, and you have a kind of period where the pilot program and the scale-up program are like produce in the same time. And usually you can completely change your supply chain between 4 and 8 years according to what we do usually. Next slide. One point which is important is the data flow. If you want to prove that you have an impact on your ecosystems and you have a good impact throughout your supply chain, that's important to manage the data. So that's why we made iSphere. iSphere is not, how to say, you can use another MRV, but that's important if you want to produce carbon credit, if you want to produce data to prove that you have a better impact between day 1 and day 2. It's important to manage your data and to harvest the farm data. Let's go. Yeah, and just as a matter of illustration, for instance, we are working for several years for Danone in all the water sheets and the water brands they have. And today we are covering 2,000 hectares, more than 50 farmers involved, and more farmers are involved in the program year after year. We have other program in Poland, for instance, within 6 months we have involved more than 20,000 hectares. So that's interesting to see that more and more the projects are bigger and we can impact more the functioning of the biosphere, because as you know, agriculture is a very important tool to regenerate ecosystems throughout the right practices. Thank you, I'm done. Thank you, Adrien. And then we can, I don't know if Morgan is here or not, because she has...
Yes, can you hear me? You can hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Yes, so let me go through the Pernod Ricard case study. So Pernod Ricard is a worldwide company dedicated to spirits and wines. So we produce famous brands like Martel Cognac, Mumm or Perrier-Jouët Champagne, or Havana Club, Rome, Absolut Vodka, and many others. And what we deeply know is that 100% of our brands rely on nature. So maybe we can go on the next slide, please. So as we know that all our brands rely on nature and well-functioning ecosystems, we decided 3 years ago to put the regeneration at the heart of our strategy. It's a matter of business resilience, of course. It's a matter of first how we address risks, and then how we generate a positive outcome. So on the next slide, you can see the type of brand with the type of raw material. For Martel, of course, it's vineyard and grapes. For all our whiskeys, we buy a lot of maize, barley, wheat, other grains as well. Havana Club is, of course, from Cuba and sugarcane. And Kahlua, it's a liquor of coffee, with coffee from Mexico. What we want to achieve in the next slide is to address all the other topics, the surrounding topics like climate change, both in terms of responsibility, how we contribute to climate change, and in parallel, how we are impacted by the effects of climate change. We also consider ecosystem and biodiversity in all our actions and programs. Micro biodiversity or micro and macro biodiversity, underground, for example, and above ground, the web of nature around the farms, and a natural ecosystem that could have a positive interaction with the farmland. And in the middle, we consider communities and smallholder farmers, or all the components at the terroir level that can interact to maximize adoption. So Sébastien talked about the farmer adoption. This is key for us to maximize awareness, training, and the adoption of practices. So on the next slide, our journey is to start by identifying the current situation, mainly driven by conventional agriculture, what we call a competition with nature. And everywhere we try to baseline the situation. What are the current farming practices? What are the current organization between people, communities, all the supply chains? What are the current economic models? And what we want to achieve is a step-by-step approach. The first step is what we call a low-impact agriculture, how we can improve practices, the sustainability of practices by reducing specific inputs, for example. So it's not a breakthrough model, it's how we improve the sustainability step by step. And when it comes to regenerative agriculture, what we want to do is to rethink globally the system, not only the field, but the farm, the network of farms and the landscape. That's why for Pernod Ricard, we decided to adopt the terroir approach. A terroir is like a sourcing location with specificities in terms of the know-how of the community, climatic and pedological components, ecosystem components, watershed, and so on and so forth. So what we want to do is to rethink all the relationships between all the components at the terroir level. So on the next slide, what we want to consider is, of course, the farmland, how a farmer how he takes his decisions, but also what happens around the farm and around the farmland. It's also to feed our net zero strategy for climate, but also the nature NBTN strategy for nature is how we consider positive loops and how we reactivate positive loops within the terroir. So we have two different types of actions, an action dedicated to regenerative agriculture and an action dedicated to nature restoration around the farms. So how we work, first, as I said, we always start with a diagnosis, a field diagnosis. So Sébastien helped us to go on the ground, to meet people, to understand relationships, the social aspect, as well as the technical institute or the economic network on a given terroir. Then we try to design the regenerative model. What we want to do is, at the corporate level, I'm talking about Pernod Ricard, is to reach big impact on climate, as I said, impact on biodiversity, on water, on soil health, on community profitability, well-being for farmers, and so on and so forth. So we start by considering impact, and then we translate all these impacts in terms of practices. We can go on the next slide, please. So, for example, we can have a set of a list of practices, a long list of practices, the practices that we consider as regenerative, and we will decide specific practices as mandatory because we need them to reach specific targets, and other practices where we can pick and choose depending on the terroir. It's really a tailor-made approach. The terroir approach at Pernod Ricard is really tailor-made. It's really dependent on the local situation, the local context. So at the group level, we have a big framework. We have a big umbrella, the regenerative philosophy, the ambition to reach and to develop at scale regenerative agriculture practices. We have a time horizon. We have resources and investment, so we can drive investment and resources. And we need to translate this big picture to the local situation everywhere. So at Pernod Ricard, we have 350 different terroirs, and we focus our attention to 60 priority terroirs. 60 priority terroirs for Pernod Ricard represent more than 98% of the annual spend, so it's really relevant. So within all these 60 priority terroirs, we need to translate the big umbrella, the big concept at Pernod Ricard corporate level into local framework, situations, and roadmaps. So what we do is to integrate the results from the field diagnosis, and we try together with the local stakeholder. It's always a collaborative approach. We try to close the gap to reach the global target. For example, we know that we have to reduce by 30% carbon emissions by 2030 at the farm level for the raw material we buy. What does it mean for a given terroir? Is it more driven by a switch of fertilizers? Is it more driven by reducing the fuel for tractor with other alternatives? Is it more driven by working deeply on irrigation because we want to reduce the energy dedicated to pumping? So it's really depending on the specificity. So it's like workshops with farmers, with wine growers, with other stakeholders to find the best balance between the feasibility of implementing practices, technical, financial feasibility. We talk about skills and capabilities as well, and the timeline. Is it feasible to reach our goal by 2030, for example? And then we try to identify how to close the gap, if there is a gap. Is it more by investing in trainings? Is it more by investing in, I think, in some terroirs, we buy directly new fertilizer for our supply chain to minimize the risk, the risk of, because when we talk to a farmer about a new practice, always the first reaction is about how it will decrease my yield. In which level I will take this risk for you. So as soon as we start a discussion with a community, we always start thinking about a new economic model. So maybe you can go in the next slide as well, I think. So it's how to translate the implementation of the practices into additional cost of production. So we try to say, okay, you will switch from a synthetic fertilizer to an organic fertilizer, or a new system to fight against pest and disease, or a new machinery to sow cover crops. What is the cost associated to this transformation of practices? And we consider two steps. The first period is about the transition, and the second period is about the running. So for the first step, we always try to act collectively. So we try to find for a given terroir other companies like Pernod Ricard that buy or either the same raw material or another raw material part of the rotation, for example, to ask the same type of to request the same type of practices for the same supply chain or supplier or group of farmers. So in the next slide, we have a few programs already implemented. So for example, we have a strong partnership with Heineken in Ireland on barley, where we want to design together the same framework for Regen Ag and say, okay, during the transition phase, what are your additional costs? And we will pay for the equipment acquisition, for trainings, and Biospheres is useful for us to train the trainer at the supplier level, for example, or to size the time horizon to say, okay, we will start to implement practices, and then in the second step, we will start to, for example, assess impact with this type and this type of analysis, or this type and this type of digital solution, I don't know. And in parallel, we always have a discussion on the future mechanism, because in many cases, it's really a long-term approach. What we want to do is to commit for the long term in terms of buying the raw materials. So we commit for volumes, we commit for a specific price mechanism, we commit for supporting the capability building. For example, in some cases, we commit to support R&D programs to innovate or to test for a given terroir a specific solution, or to create new varieties and to be more agile regarding the effect of climate change. So now we have many different programs, and we always need to have a strong partnerships like the one we have with Biospheres, to have technical expertise. It's always mandatory to have a technical expertise, as well as to have a third party able to say, okay, let's find a common solution to close the gap. Is it more this kind of indicator? Is it more this kind of tool or a type of analysis? Is it to find this kind of expertise, local expertise? So it's always good to have to open our mind and to have a collaborative approach. So it's always Pernod Ricard plus another market company, and always an NGO or a technical provider like Biosphere, and one or two suppliers locally to drive the change. So I think I'm done on my case study, Pernod Ricard case study. So I think if you have any questions, this is time for questions.
Thank you, Morgane. Thank you for all those very interesting learnings about Pernod Ricard and the implementation of more sustainable farm practices. So to all the attendees, you can ask your questions in the chat of the webinar. So in the meantime, we have a few questions for you, Morgane, and for you, Sébastien. First, what kind of advice would you give to companies looking to get started with the implementation of regen ag and other sustainable practices?
Sorry, this is for me, maybe?
Or for you both, Sébastien and Morgane.
For you both. On my side, maybe to start to answer your question, my main feedback would be to listen the ground, not coming with the army of documents, guidelines, requirements, digital solutions, startups, and so on and so forth. So my main advice would be to start listening the ground, listening farmers, and to say, okay, you know your work, you know your job. We just want together to transform your farm for resilience. So how we can collaborate, how we can support you in this journey. So listening the ground for me is the main action.
Yeah, I would say it's maybe the most important, because actually this is not a technical transition, because actually we have the technical pathway and the expertise, and actually the most tricky point is adoption and the execution of those new practices, because the impact you may have on your supply chain is not correlated to the theory of those practices, but to the execution of the farmers on the ground. So that's why if you want people to act, they need to feel involved in the process, and they need to feel respected in the process. So that's why it's very important. And actually we design our approach year after year to focus a lot on this exploring phase and audit phase, because it helps us to understand how we should design the pilot programs and the scale-up program in such a way that we can reinforce our ability to increase the adoption rate. So actually, for me, one of the best advice is to say, okay, you should consider that you are in a psychological and social transition more than a technical solution transition. Even if we are facing, of course, some technical challenges, but the social challenges, breaking some traditions and some habits, somehow is more difficult than changing some techniques with a few new machineries and new techniques. Yeah.
Thank you very much for those enlightening insights. So one question to Morgan. What obstacles and levers do you need to activate to implement these practices in the field or on the ground?
Sorry, can you repeat the beginning of your question?
Yes. What obstacles and levers do you need to activate to implement these practices in the field or on the ground?
I think on my side, I need to slow down because, for example, at corporate level, we have urgent targets to achieve by 2030, and when it comes to agriculture, it's tomorrow. And on the ground, the time is not the same. So this is the main obstacle, I think, to try to accelerate the decision making on the ground. I think the main lever is to start at small scale. That's why piloting is key, essential. Start with the pioneer farmers. Starting with pioneer is a way to demonstrate. So when we work with a specific cooperative, for example, we start to identify the best in class. Okay, if it's possible for them, maybe we can build on this to share with other farmers. So small scale first to demonstrate, and then large scale. So it's the main obstacle on the ground. And then the second obstacle is the size of the investment to transform 100%, for example, of our sourcing under regenerative agriculture. Today, we don't have the business case to demonstrate internally, I mean, because the cost of this transformation is still today huge for Pernod Ricard. So this is why the reason why we try to act collectively. When we act collectively, we can invest in common. That's why when we have collaborative programs, it's better in terms of implementation. We share the risk all together, and we share the benefits as well, and we can accelerate. So never act together alone, because it's too risky, it's not affordable today for us to maximize at a super large scale. We need to build. It's a step by step. We need to maybe we need to create coalitions with the investors, with insurance, with banks, with many other players, because together we are too small. Even if we are Pernod Ricard, we are too small.
Very much, Morgan. Sébastien, do you wish to add on that?
Yeah, actually, I think coalition are more and more a topic. Actually, before last year, we didn't have so much demand on facilitating consortium and coalition. Now it's something which is more and more a topic, because actually, if you want to convince farmer to change, you have to take into account that they have a kind of investment to do to change the practices, even if we are designing the practices in such a way that they don't really. My principle is to say, okay, we should save money from day one, but at the end, farmers need incentive. And to stabilize interesting incentives for them in terms of premium price, and even if you are connecting it to carbon credit or not, it's something important. And in coalition, it's better, especially for crops which are in rotation. If you are working in like a perennial crop and you have only trees or only vineyards, it's not so much a problem because you are taking the crop from the field and that's it. But if we are talking about crop in rotation, for instance, cereals or vegetables, if you are just sourcing the wheat or just sourcing the barley or just sourcing the rapeseed, that's very important to have a coalition where other stakeholders can buy the other crops. Then you have a rotation approach and not a crop approach. And only the coalition helps to do that. And that's interesting to see that we have more and more demand on that, or we are working in projects where another experts or company is doing the coalition and we are implementing the project for them. So that's important what Morgan says. You have to reinforce your building capacity throughout coalition, or except if you are like a big stakeholder in your supply, then you have the will and the power to act alone.
Okay, thank you very much. Coalition is key indeed to transforming all the value chain and all its actors, all its stakeholders. One question to you both, Morgan and Sébastien. Could you please tell us more about your collaboration? How did it come about? When did it start? And what were the initial objectives? And where are you today?
I think we started 3 years ago when I arrived at Pernod Ricard to design the nurturing terroir strategy. So it was to have a third party, an external expertise to challenge the ambition, to challenge the type of actions. So it was how to support the strategy making 3 years ago. And I think just after, we started to discuss with our French vineyards how to accelerate regenerative viticulture on the ground. So Biospheres supported us in the workshops, so the first 1 week field diagnosis in each location to better understand the local situation, the network, the stakeholders, the practices, the risks, the consequences of specific decisions, and to start raise awareness on regeneration, how to regenerate the terroir, how to regenerate the vineyard, and how to adapt the vineyard for the coming years. So Sébastien and the team supported us to raise awareness through training, through conference, through field visits together with the technical team and stakeholders, and then to build the actions and the action plan, the roadmap. It's a 3 to 5 year roadmap. So to build this action plan together with the local team, the technical team, and then to support them during the 3 years operations by being present on the ground. And maybe I will hand over to Sébastien to explain how it goes on the ground. But it was to have this external expertise to support on a daily basis the practice implementation and the decision making.
Yeah, so it has started a few years ago. The first, actually, what we did is really was a workflow I presented to you. So it's like I went on the ground with my team. We understood how the vineyards were working, how to connect with the people on the ground. And then we built a framework which were very tailor-made according to what was required by vineyards. So that was very interesting, and that was a journey, mainly organized around experiments. It was really a pilot, the pilot phase that we developed with Pernod Ricard on those vineyards. And we work mainly in France. We start in Argentina and in Armenia as well. So that's interesting to see that we can develop actually tailor-made approach, but with the same framework throughout the world. That's important as well to have this approach that can be scalable at the end, because the reporting must be consistent throughout the different terroir and the different projects. And that's an extension of our collaboration, which has started few months ago, to have a kind of worldwide framework that can be used for regenerative supply chain on many raw materials. So I don't know what I can say, Morgan. So maybe if you want to express yourself on that, because we have plenty of NDA, so I don't want to
Yes.
go beyond. But yeah, that's something which is important actually for any company. I think your reporting system generally should be very importantly, it should be consistent throughout your supply chain, because otherwise your reporting, if your reporting is not consistent, you will get plenty of problems to prove, to factualize what you do. So I think now more and more we have more and more demand at Biosphere level to work on those aspects, because I think it's a kind of critical point. So yeah, I don't know if Morgan, you want to express yourself on that or not, but at the end,
No, yes,
more something interesting to work on.
Yeah, it's a matter of credibility, because at corporate level we need to disclose many impacts, KPIs. If we talk about regenerative agriculture, we need to share evidences, and that's why we were thinking about a way to collect data on the ground and to consolidate data into big KPIs. So of course we have the climate, GHG emissions, carbon removals, KPI, but it's a matter of exploring other impacts. So if we want to have a voice and to extend regenerative agriculture at scale, we need to be clear on the impact, on the benefits. And we are, as a big company, we are audited each year. So we need to share and to be transparent on the two approaches. The first is how we implement means, practices. And the second approach is how we generate outcomes or impact. So we need to be transparent and to share how we do that and how we estimate, how we assess our impact. That's why we discuss a lot with Biospheres and Sébastien about the type of indicators, the type of data we want to collect to consolidate big impact assessment.
Okay, thank you very much. Is it possible to let us know a little more about how you coordinate so all these corporate level indicators, such as your company's carbon footprint, for reaching your corporate emission reduction targets, with all these on-the-ground work with farmers and supply chain? How does it work? How do you consolidate this information? Who is in charge of collecting data, processing it, analyzing it?
Big topic. So what we want and what we have is specific data from what we call our hotspots. So for example, for the carbon footprint, we know which kind of terroir and which supplier contribute to our hotspots. Our hotspots are 90% of the global carbon emissions for ingredients. Ingredients represent 50% of the carbon footprint for Panoreca. So if we want to start the journey of net zero, we need to have a baseline made with specific emission factors, specific data. That's why I need specific emission factors from suppliers. So the first step is to engage a discussion with suppliers. So it's me at HQ, at corporate, with local buyers at affiliate level, starting to talk about the methodologies. So we have set specific, we have developed specific calculators to obtain a specific emission factor for cereals, for vineyards, for other crops. So we share, it's an open source. So we share the material with the suppliers to collect data. So to do that, we collect, I think it's a 3-year average data collection from the last 3 harvests, for example, in average. But we collect master data. We collect specific data. So it's like average data on the amount and the type of fertilizer, the type of energy, everything related to the farming practices. And we try to follow, for us, it's under the SBTi net zero and flag guidelines, and we follow the GHG protocol. So it's not easy because the majority of our suppliers are not super familiar with all those topics. So it's a matter of training, sharing session, demo, how we fill in our tools, how we estimate the future possibilities to reduce emissions. So it's a matter of collecting baseline data and then working directly with the suppliers to find working ways of working. What are the frequencies to collect data, which kind of data, our level of transparency to be able then to audit the data. So this is for the baseline. And then we try to identify levers to reduce emissions, for example. And we use the same tool to estimate what could be the landing in 2030 by implementing this or this practice, what could be the landing in terms of carbon emissions. And then we translate this into a framework and a contract with the farmer. And within the contract, we ask for the data transparency. We ask for specific practice implementation. So it's really an ongoing discussion managed by myself at corporate level for my team, and people at affiliate level, so many buyers in direct contact with the suppliers. So it's a daily basis conversation because we share with our communities almost every month new rules, new requirements, because we talk a lot about climate, the GHG protocol. When we want to model carbon sequestration, we talk about TNEOS, for example, so new tools. And tomorrow we will ask for, because we want to explore the SBTN trajectory. So we want to explore water. What is the water footprint, biodiversity footprint? So it's more data to come. That's why we need to be conscious of the burden for suppliers and farmers, and find the right balance because existing data and the KPI we want to measure. So it's always an ongoing discussion. We don't want to push for a single standard provided by Pernod Ricard, but we want to collect what is already in place at the supplier level in terms of tools, data collections, type of verification system, to find the best balance between our expectations and what they do on the ground.
Thank you very much for that very, very detailed explanation, Morgane. Sébastien, do you wish to add on that? Very briefly, we are already 3 minutes beyond the time, but we have a few moments for comments if you need.
No, actually, I think it was very complete. I would say at the end, it's important to connect your methodology to harvest data on the ground and your impact to the regulation. It's moving, it's changing all the time. It's not completely fixed at this time. But what is important is to be quite proactive on that, to anticipate that all the regulation in the next years will be around land use, water. Land use is connected to soil actually, and soil occupancy, water, biodiversity, and carbon/climate, and social, but throughout different topic and KPIs according to the country where you are. So it's very important to connect what you are doing to those dimensions and aspects. And it's important also to not to master what happens really on the ground, because it's not just a matter of an Excel file which is complete, and you know, sometimes you have a kind of progression on the Excel file, but on the land it's not so much happening. So it's very important to have the ability to understand what happens on the ground and to appreciate if the project is going in the right way, if the project has a real impact. So that's why choosing the right criteria and the right KPI is very important to follow this impact. It's a kind of dashboard, like in a car. You need to understand the speed, you need to understand if you have enough oil, if the temperature is okay. So that's important for any kind of company that wants to be impactful, to really understand that those KPIs must be meaningful and easy to harvest as well, scalable, because most of the time if you are choosing like a very expensive KPI, it can affect a lot the budget, and it cannot be scalable. And then if you are changing the KPI from one year to another, you don't have the track record, and it can be tricky then to report. So most you are prone to have this monitoring system, which is okay. More you can develop projects that you can measure the impact, and you can be clear with the suppliers about the rules of this regenerative supply chain and the process behind.
Thank you very much, Sébastien. So we'll close the webinar now. You can find our contact details here in this slide. Of course, all the attendees will receive a link to get the recording of this presentation and the slide deck. And of course, please feel free to reach out to any of us for any question you may have. Many questions have not been answered in the short time that we have for the Q&A, but rest assured we are available for a call if you wish. Thank you very much, Morgan. Thank you very much, Sébastien.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to everyone for attending and taking the time for that presentation. And hope to see you soon.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.
Have a nice day.